Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
The way to the promised land is through the wilderness. Exodus 19, in the wilderness we discover who God really is. God deliberately takes people that he loves into the wilderness to reveal who he is and who they are.
Today with Jeff Vines, pastor, apologist, and Bible teacher.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Today with Jeff Vines. In this series, Ghosted, Pastor Jeff is talking about the times we feel ghosted by God and he's suddenly distant. This term ghosted is a modern social media term, but as we look into the Bible, we can see what happens when it seems God is distant. Let's get into it now. Here's Pastor Jeff to begin today's message.
We're continuing our series called Ghosted, Exodus 19. If you have your Bible, have an iPad, iPhone, Exodus 19. If I had to subtitle this sermon, it would be called Ghosted, Blessed in the Wilderness. And like any language, even social media language is evolving, which means definitions are evolving. So I got a new definition now, updated, of ghosting. And here's what it is. Also known as simmering or icing. Describes the practice of ending all communication and contact with another person without any apparent warning or justification. And we've said in this series, sometimes in our lives it feels like God does that to us. When we need him the worst, we just feel like he's nowhere in sight. Now, just quickly, can I ask you, are there some people in your life that you wish would ghost you? In the first two messages, we said that God deliberately takes people that he loves into the wilderness to reveal who he is and who they are. And this cannot be overstated, because God knows in order to reveal his nature, who he truly is, to have that relationship ultimately that he wants with his people, that he's going to have to take us into times of the wilderness. And in the wilderness, we're going to feel ghosted. But in our last sermon, we emphasize that the reality is God never ghosts you. It's never him that's moved. It's you. He's not ghosted us. We've ghosted him. And so I encourage you, and I have to repeat this before we get into Exodus 19, in those seasons of your life then when you do feel ghosted and you feel that you've lost control and clarity and consequence, you've got to reorder your life. And if you'll reorder your life, you'll be able to return to the story of God's love. And when you return to the story of God's love, you'll feel that prevailing presence that's been missing. Now, chapter 19. And I just want to give you from the get-go, I almost cut this section because I thought, you know what, I got to preach a 30-minute sermon this week. I've been hard on them. No such luck. I've got three symbols in front of me that I will often go to when I think or doubt God's presence in my own life. The first are these barbells that I brought out. They're not heavy, that's why I can carry them. But every time I see weights like this, it reminds me of a time in my life I was running marathons in New Zealand, and I looked terrible. Felt great, but looked terrible. And I had my photo taken with my wife after a 22-mile run. And I looked at the photo and I thought, wow, dude, you look horrible. I look so thin. I mean, I'm thin and lean by nature, but I look so pale. I look like I just got out of a POW camp of some kind. It was that bad. So I made a turn at that moment. No, I'm not going to run anymore. I'm going to go to the gym now. So I wrote my good friend Tony Bennett, Coach Bennett, and I said, hey, give me a workout program. And I started going to the gym. Now, you know what happens when you go to the gym, right? It's painful, man. I mean, you're tearing down all the time. I got on this protein mix that back then they hadn't sweetened them yet, so they taste like chalk. And I was drinking creatine about a half an hour before I went to the gym, and it tastes like, I don't know, just horrible. And the reason I bring this up is this symbol in my life reminds me that without a certain amount of pain, there will never be any gain, right? Right? Now, this is another image that every time I see a rope, somewhat of this nature, I think of one of my favorite Old Testament narratives of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And if you read that text carefully, the writer goes to great lengths to teach you something. Because when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are put into the furnace, the guards come over, and the furnace is so hot that they're basically vaporized, incinerated, remember? And yet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're able to go on in. And the writer tells us 3 times that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their hair was not torched, the skin was not burned, their clothing was not even singed. And then he goes on to say the only thing that was burned was that which was binding them. So when they went into the furnace, the only thing that was burned was the thing that was binding them, so that they could be freed to experience the presence of Jesus in the middle of the furnace. And then I've got this one. I've said numerous times, one of the things that intimidates me is in seminary I learned what it really meant for us to be the clay and for God to be the potter. And I thought, wow, how can that be good news to anybody? Because the idea is that when you're on the potter's wheel, there are times when you're just not cooperating. And the potter will have to throw you down onto the ground, misshape you, and start all over. And all 3 of these symbols reminded me of the thing that I'm trying to say to you throughout this entire series. You may feel ghosted at times in your life by God, but God has never been more present than He is now. And the only way you can get to the promised land is if you're willing to go through the wilderness. That's the only way. Now let me show you how that plays out in the first 2 verses. Verse 1 of chapter 19. On the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Now, in a moment I'm going to show you something, but for right now, let me show you what's going on here. Beautiful narrative. You'd be wise to follow along. So God and Moses say to the Israelites, we're going to take you to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the promised land, Palestine. The children of Israel say, great, and they trusted them. And halfway in the journey, they roll down the window to see where they are. And they're on the Sinai Peninsula. Now they are farther away from the promised land than they were when they were in Egypt. If you look at this map on the screen, you'll notice to your far upward left, this is where they crossed the Red Sea. There is a quasi-direct route over to the promised land. But instead, look where God takes them, all the way down south on the Sinai Peninsula. They are now farther away from the promised land than they were when they crossed the Red Sea. You think about it. It's been 2 months since you left Egypt. You roll down the car window expecting to see milk and honey. Instead, it's as dry as the Sinai. It's worse than Egypt. And when you stop the car, you're in a mountainous desert. And here is the point that the writer is attempting to make in the first 2 verses. God led them in the opposite direction to where they thought He was taking them, and so it always goes. You know, sometimes when I see someone baptized, I will immediately pray for them, God protect them in the wilderness. Because I know when they're baptized, their life's about to get tough. Now, do you see how damaging it is when you think when you get baptized, now everything's going to be easy? Because in that moment, you made Jesus the Lord of your life and you gave Him permission to start working on you. Your life is about to get tough. And I just pray for that person. God, I don't even know them intimately. I may not even know their name, but God, please be with them in the wilderness. Where was Jesus led after His baptism? Into the wilderness. Why after His baptism? Let me ask you something. Now stay with me here. Do you think Jesus had a choice of whether or not to die on the cross? Absolutely. Otherwise, His prayer in the garden would make no sense. He said, Father, not my will, but yours be done. So if His will must have been different than the Father's. And in that moment in His humanity, He said, okay, Lord, not my will, but yours be done. So why after His baptism in the wilderness does he have this temptation? And the answer is, Jesus' baptism was very similar to yours and mine. He wasn't baptized for the forgiveness of sin. He was baptized as the inauguration to his accepting the role of Messiahship. When he was baptized, he's saying to the Father, I'll do it. I accept the role. He had grown in wisdom and stature, and now, being fully aware of his identity, I will do it. I will go to the cross. And immediately he's taken into the wilderness. And immediately he is tempted. Now, yes, he has 3 temptations, but he's there for 40 days and 40 nights, so I'm assuming that God is also doing his mighty work in his Son to prepare him for the greatest feat known to mankind. So here's the point, and I'm going to labor it just a moment for you in your life. Like Jesus, as soon as you gave your life to God, boom, God deliberately takes you into the wilderness. Why? Because there's a lot of work to be done on you. You give your life to Jesus, things are going to get tough, and you end up farther away from the things you thought God was going to give you. You thought you were going in the promised land, but now you're all the way down here in the Sinai Peninsula. There must be some mistake. No, you may be farther away from the things you want, but that's only because God loves you and he's trying to give you the things you truly need, the things for which your soul ultimately cries. Now, let me tell you something else about this Exodus narrative. The whole narrative arc, the entire narrative arc from the Passover to the Exodus to Mount Sinai is the largest and most extended visual aid ever planned. What do I mean by that? This entire narrative, the arc of this story, is a visual, the largest one ever, for how your life is going to go. To get to the promised land, you got to go through the wilderness. It's true of Moses. It's true of Jesus. It's going to be true of you. Now, let me give you one more example. In the Old Testament, scholars tell us that there are what they call Jesus types. A Jesus type is an Old Testament character that if you were to schematize their lives, the arc would be very similar to the life of Jesus. So Moses is a type of Christ. He saves his people, right? Another one is Joseph. And just because I know you're familiar with Joseph, let me give you a little summary and analogy and then I'll move on. Do you remember what happened in Dothan to Joseph? Do you know the story of Joseph's family? Jacob loved his wife Rachel more than Leah. Therefore, he loved Rachel's children more than Leah's children. Joseph belonged to Rachel, therefore Jacob doted on him. And I don't know if you realize this, but Joseph became a spoiled little brat and an arrogant teenager. I mean, he has these dreams where his brothers are bowing down to him. Now, he did have them, and I think he had them because God was revealing to him that you're about to go into the wilderness, but take care, I'm with you, and I'm going to do a great thing with you. But if you have a dream where your brothers are bowing down, it's probably best you kept that to yourself. So his brothers become bitter and cynical, and they hate him. And then they want to kill him. And the whole family's in a total mess because of what Jacob has done. He has split the family with his favoritism. And any child who's been in a home where one was favored over the other knows what that's like. It goes with you the rest of your life. And of course, Joseph's not helping matters. He brags about it. So when Joseph's brothers are in Dothan and they see an Ishmaelite caravan coming by, they have thrown Joseph in the pit, trying to determine what they're going to do with him. They decide, you know what, let's sell him into slavery. They actually were going to kill him and then blame it on a wild animal, which is the story they end up telling their father anyway. They sell him to the passing Ishmaelites, so they're going to get rid of their brother while making a little money at the same time. Now, Joseph lives in the wilderness, ends up in the dungeon, and begins to cry out to the God of his father Jacob. Now, do you know how long he cried out? He goes into the prison at 17 years of age. He doesn't make it to the palace until he's 30. How often do you think Joseph thought God ghosted him? And yet God is involved in saving a people, a family, a nation, and you and me. No, Joseph, no messianic line. Think about that. You and I have an advantage of seeing the end of the book of Genesis, so we know that God was doing something more than saving Joseph. He was saving all of us. From the prison was preparation for the palace. Now, again, I want to labor this just a moment. Let's say God had just showed up and talked to Joseph. Joseph, you, my friend, are a spoiled little brat. Joseph, 15, 16 years old. Don't you realize if you keep going down this road, your brother's going to hate you, you'll destroy your family, and perhaps the line of the Messiah? Can I ask you something? Have you ever tried to say anything to a teenager? Even if God showed up, they wouldn't listen, right? John Newton says, no one ever learned they were a sinner by being told. They have to be shown. And it took years of the wilderness for God to break Joseph and prompt Joseph's father and his brothers to be open to grace and forgiveness. So some of you might be in the wilderness right now, which is typical of our lives, and you might be saying, well, how long do I have to stay in here? And here's the answer. You're not going to like it until you are shaped, formed, and conformed to the image of Christ. Then you can go out. Your whole life is a wilderness journey. I'll go one more step. The only way to the resurrection is through the cross. God can't end pain and suffering and evil without ending you and me. If you want Him to end all pain, suffering, and evil, He's got to end us because we're the cause of it. Or He can pay the penalty of our sin and redeem us. But redemption comes only after a cross. And what I'm trying to say to you, this is true of your life too. All wrapped up into verse 1 and 2. The way to the promised land is through the wilderness. Now, let's move on. In the wilderness, guess what? We discover who God really is. Now, this section of the sermon, I got to remind myself to slow down a bit. You cannot miss this. You just can't. You don't get this, you don't get the Bible. If you miss this, you're never going to understand God or the Scriptures. You say, Pastor Jeff, you've been saying that when we're in the wilderness, we learn who God is for 3 weeks, but you still haven't told us who He is. Because I've been waiting for chapter 19. Here we go. Verse 3. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you're to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you're to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession, although the whole earth is mine. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Now, there is an order here that must never be upset in your mind. There's a sequence here that must remain. And what is it? Here it is. Salvation by grace, obedience, blessing. Salvation by grace, obedience, blessing. And if you ever confuse that sequence, you're going to forget who God really is. The joy of your salvation will be sucked dry, and you will find obedience very difficult and blessings rare. Have you ever thought about this? When God visited Moses in the burning bush, okay, He could have given Moses the 10 Commandments right there. And He could have said, Moses, you take these 10 Commandments back to my people in bondage, and you tell them, when they start obeying me, then I'll rescue and save them. But that's not the order. The order is this. God first saves the children of Israel. He first delivers them. God does not first give them the law, then say, if you obey it, then I will save you. No. And if you confuse that, you're never going to have any joy in this, ever. Verse 4, you yourself have seen what I did in Egypt, or to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings. Folks, the imagery is captivating. And I can only deal with two pictures. Number one, the writer is telling you that faith in God means more than just believing God is powerful. It means believing that He actually cares about you. Many people believe that God exists. But many people also believe that God is detached, which is very convenient on the one hand, because if God is detached, then I have no responsibility. If He's not revealed Himself and if He's not involved, then I just live the way I want, and then one day it'll all work out, which is what most of the world believes. But if God is detached, it also means that you're on this journey in the wilderness all on your own because God does not care. But the bigger question that I often ask the skeptic concerning this issue is this. You have to ask yourself then, why would an uncaring God create a caring human being? Why is it that when you look at someone who's less fortunate or someone in need that you look with weeping eyes? If you are created by a non-caring being, how are you going to explain the fact that you care? And the answer is because you've been created in the image of your Father. And when you look at people with compassion, you have your Father's eyes. But the larger point is that when he says, I carried you on eagle's wings, it's a word picture for an effortless time of flight. Only a few birds are capable of this, right? Eagles glide. We've been over this before. They're beautiful creatures. His wings are so strong and powerful. And he's capable of catching these rising currents of air that push up from the earth's surface up into the atmosphere. And eagles can catch those on their wings, and they can glide at almost 80 miles per hour. 80 miles per hour, just rocketing through the air, soaring on these invisible columns of air. So, if you're soaring on eagle's wings, now remember, most birds carry their young where? Below the wings. And the reason is because that way nothing above can get them. But nothing flies higher than eagles. Nothing is stronger. Nothing is more powerful. And so when we're told that he brought us out on eagle's wings, if you are soaring on eagle's wings, what are you doing? Nothing. You're doing nothing. It's all his effort. Everything is provided. You sit back, keep your arms and legs inside You sit back and enjoy. God said to his people, now because I saved you by sheer grace, because I brought you out of Egypt, obey me. You're saved, obey me, and the blessings will come. You will never understand the whole Bible until you understand grace, obedience, blessings. And if you mess this up, can I tell you that the wilderness will become a living hell? If you go through your life thinking, man, if I obey, God will accept me and bless me. If I just obey, then God will accept me. Then you will never know what it is to be loved and accepted because you're never going to know full obedience. You're going to blow it again and again. So rather than have joy, you'll have hate. Rather than have peace, you'll have resentment. Don't you see why God gives us this sequence? God loves you. He wants your obedience, yes, but only because he loves you. Because God is wise. He wants your best life. And he knows that your best life comes when you obey his precepts. Because they're not meant to bind you, they're meant to free you.
You've been listening to Today with Jeff Vines. Thanks for joining us. Next time, we'll bring you the rest of this message from Pastor Jeff.
If you just look at his commandments as a way for God to rule over you, then when you're faced with two decisions or a decision and two choices, and you think by violating that precept of God, all you're doing is violating the commandment for which you will get forgiveness, then you will never obey. It's only when you start to realize that when you violate the commandment, you wound and break the heart of God.
You can listen to more messages like this. Just search for Today with Jeff Vines wherever you get your podcasts.
You make me wanna dance and sing with every single breath I breathe. I will bring this offering. You are my wonder, you bring the wonder.
Today with Jeff Vines.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.